What if I told you that in February 1637, a single tulip bulb sold for 10,000 guilders, enough money to buy the most expensive house on Amsterdam's most prestigious canal? What if I told you that just 1 month later, that same bulb was worth less than an onion? And what if I told you that this wasn't just a quirky historical footnote, but the world's first recorded speculative bubble that nearly destroyed Europe's most advanced economy? The Dutch Tulip Mania of 1634 to 1637 challenges everything we think we know about rational markets and intelligent investors. Here was a society that had created the world's first stock exchange, pioneered international banking, and built a global trading empire. These weren't primitive peasants. They were sophisticated merchants who understood risk, value, and profit better than anyone in human history. Yet for 3 years, these rational economic actors convinced themselves that flower bulbs were worth more than gold, that tulip futures could make them rich beyond imagination, and that the laws of supply and demand had been permanently suspended. When reality finally reasserted itself, the crash was so severe it triggered economic panic across Europe and left thousands of families ruined. But here's the mystery that historians and economists are still debating. Was tulip mania really about tulips at all? Or was it something far more dangerous, the world's first encounter with the psychological forces that drive modern financial markets? The evidence suggests that what happened in 17th century Holland wasn't an isolated historical curiosity, but a template for every bubble, crash, and financial panic that followed. Welcome to the Economic Historian. Today we're exploring how flour nearly brought down civilization's most advanced economy and why the patterns established in Dutch tulip fields are playing out right now in cryptocurrency markets, meme stocks, and social media trading forums. To understand how tulips could threaten an entire economy, we need to understand just how extraordinary the Dutch Republic was in the early 1600s. This was the world's first truly modern economy, a society that had accidentally invented capitalism while fighting for independence from Spanish rule. The Dutch had created something unprecedented in human history, a nation built on trade rather than conquest, wealth rather than warfare, innovation rather than tradition. Amsterdam had become Europe's financial capital, home to the world's first stock exchange, the first central bank, and the first multinational corporations. Dutch merchants traded from the Arctic to Indonesia. Their ships carried goods across every ocean, and their financial instruments financed commerce across continents. Most importantly, the Dutch had developed the world's most sophisticated financial markets. They had invented short selling, futures contracts, and options trading. They understood leverage, margin trading, and complex derivatives. Dutch investors could buy shares in the Dutch East India Company, history's first publicly traded corporation, or speculate on grain futures, currency fluctuations, and commodity prices. This financial sophistication created unprecedented prosperity. Amsterdam's population had doubled in 50 years. New canals were being dug to accommodate expanding merchant districts. Art, science, and philosophy flourished as wealth created leisure, and education created inquiry. The Dutch Republic was experiencing what historians call the Golden Age, a period of cultural and economic achievement that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. But this prosperity came with unexpected consequences. The Dutch had created the world's first consumer society, where ordinary people had disposable income and investment opportunities. Craftsmen, shopkeepers, and even servants could participate in financial markets that had previously been limited to aristocrats and merchants. For the first time in history, getting rich quick wasn't just a fantasy. It was a realistic possibility for anyone with savings and nerve. The tulip, introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1500s, fit perfectly into this new economic reality. Unlike most flowers, tulips could produce spectacular variations through a viral infection that created intricate patterns and vibrant colors. Each infected bulb was unique, beautiful, and most importantly, rare. In a society obsessed with status, display, and conspicuous consumption, owning exotic tulips became the ultimate symbol of wealth and sophistication. Initially, tulips were luxury goods for the wealthy. A skilled craftsman might earn 300 guilders per year, while a single rare tulip bulb could cost 1,000 guilders or more. But the Dutch financial system had created something dangerous, the ability to buy expensive items with borrowed money and defer payments. Futures contracts, originally designed for grain and commodity trading, were adapted for tulip bulbs. Suddenly, ordinary people could speculate on tulip prices without actually owning tulips. By 1634, Tulip trading had evolved from a luxury market into something entirely new, a speculative bubble driven by financial innovation, social psychology, and the intoxicating possibility of unlimited wealth. The stage was set for an economic experiment that would end in disaster and create lessons that remain relevant 4 centuries later. The transformation of tulips from expensive flowers into speculative instruments didn't happen overnight. It began in the early 1630s when Dutch horticulturists discovered they could predict and somewhat control the viral infections that created the most valuable tulip varieties. This scientific breakthrough meant that rare tulips weren't just accidents of nature. They could be cultivated, bred, and produced with increasing reliability. More importantly, tulip bulbs had a unique characteristic that made them perfect for speculation. They could only be planted and harvested once a year, during specific seasonal windows. This created natural scarcity and time pressure that drove psychological urgency among buyers. If you missed this year's planting season, you'd have to wait 12 months for another opportunity. The Dutch financial system quickly adapted to this seasonal constraint. Merchants developed wind trade contracts, agreements to buy tulip bulbs that wouldn't be delivered until the next harvest season. These were essentially futures contracts, allowing traders to speculate on tulip prices without owning actual bulbs or having the money to pay for them immediately. Wind trade democratized tulip speculation. A carpenter earning 300 guilders annually could sign a contract to buy a 3,000 guilder tulip bulb, betting that he could sell the contract for a profit before payment came due. If tulip prices rose, he could make more money in a single transaction than he earned in a decade of labor. If prices fell, he could simply walk away from the contract. There were few legal mechanisms to enforce payment. By 1635, tulip trading had moved from exclusive garden parties and wealthy merchant circles into taverns, inns, and working-class neighborhoods. Blacksmiths, weavers, chimney sweeps, and maids were signing contracts for tulip bulbs worth more than their lifetime earnings. Professional traders began organizing collegia, semi-formal trading clubs that met regularly to buy and sell tulip contracts. The psychology driving this expansion was intoxicating and dangerous. Stories circulated of servants who had bought the right tulip contracts and retired wealthy, of craftsmen who had traded single bulbs for entire houses, of families who had transformed their fortunes through shrewd tulip investments. These success stories, whether true or exaggerated, created powerful social pressure to participate in tulip trading. But perhaps most dangerous was the way tulip mania inverted traditional Dutch values. The Republic had been built on hard work, careful saving, and prudent investment. Tulip trading promised to make these virtues obsolete. Why spend years building a business when you could become rich in a single season through clever speculation? Why save money slowly when tulip contracts offered the possibility of instant wealth? By early 1636, tulip mania had created its own economic ecosystem. Professional tulip traders, amateur speculators, tavern-based trading clubs, and informal networks of family and friends all participated in an increasingly complex web of contracts, commitments, and cross-obligations. The total value of tulip contracts in circulation may have exceeded the annual economic output of several Dutch provinces. Most ominously, the success of tulip trading was attracting participants who had no interest in flowers, no knowledge of horticulture, and no understanding of the underlying market fundamentals. They were speculating purely on price movements, betting that someone else would pay more tomorrow for contracts they were buying today. The tulip market was transforming from a luxury goods market into something unprecedented, a purely speculative bubble driven by psychological momentum rather than economic logic. By the winter of 1636 to 1637, tulip mania had reached levels that seemed to defy economic gravity. Single bulbs were selling for prices that exceeded annual salaries for skilled craftsmen. The famous Semper Augustus tulip, considered the most beautiful variety ever created, commanded prices of up to 10,000 guilders. Put this in perspective. A luxurious Amsterdam canal house cost about 3,000 guilders. The speculation had become so intense that tulip contracts were being traded multiple times per day, with prices rising by 20% or more in single trading sessions. Professional merchants abandoned their traditional businesses to focus exclusively on tulip trading. Farmers mortgaged their land to buy tulip contracts. Even children were reportedly trading tulip bulbs in school playgrounds. The most dangerous innovation was the emergence of purely paper-based tulip trading. Speculators were buying and selling contracts for tulip bulbs that didn't exist, hadn't been planted, and might never be harvested. These naked contracts were backed by nothing more than promises to pay in hopes that prices would continue rising. Credit expanded dramatically to fuel this speculation. Dutch banks, traditionally conservative institutions, began lending money specifically for tulip investments. Informal credit networks emerged, allowing people to borrow against expected tulip profits to finance additional tulip purchases. Some speculators were leveraged 10 to 1 or higher, controlling tulip contracts worth tens of thousands of guilders while possessing only hundreds of guilders in actual assets. The social dynamics became as important as the economic fundamentals. Tulip trading created new forms of social status and community belonging. Successful speculators were celebrated as financial geniuses, invited to exclusive gatherings, and treated as local celebrities. Failure to participate in tulip trading could result in social exclusion and professional isolation. Perhaps most tellingly, rational voices warning about tulip price levels were shouted down or ignored. Conservative merchants who questioned whether flowers could really be worth more than houses were dismissed as old-fashioned or jealous. Religious leaders who preached against speculation were accused of not understanding modern commerce. Government officials who suggested market regulation were told they would destroy Dutch prosperity. The final stage of the mania involved the complete separation of tulip prices from any rational valuation method. Speculators developed elaborate justifications for why traditional economic rules didn't apply to tulips. They were uniquely beautiful, internationally coveted, permanently scarce, and destined to become currency for global luxury trade. These arguments allowed participants to maintain belief in ever-rising prices, even as those prices reached obviously unsustainable levels. By February 1637, tulip mania had created an alternate economic reality where flowers were more valuable than gold. Speculation was considered a legitimate profession, and the normal rules of supply, demand, and rational valuation had been suspended indefinitely. The Dutch Republic, Europe's most sophisticated economy, had convinced itself that the laws of economics no longer applied. The collapse, when it came, was as sudden and devastating as the rise had been gradual and intoxicating. On February 3, 1637, at a routine tulip auction in Haarlem, something unprecedented happened. Nobody bid. For the first time in months, tulip bulbs failed to find buyers at expected prices. Within days, panic selling had spread across the Dutch Republic. The psychological shift was immediate and catastrophic. Speculators who had been convinced that tulip prices could only rise suddenly realized they were holding contracts for flowers that nobody wanted to buy. The same social networks that had spread tulip enthusiasm now spread tulip panic. Stories of failed auctions, canceled contracts, and desperate sellers created a stampede toward the exits. The mechanics of the crash revealed the fundamental instability of the entire system. Most tulip trading had been conducted on credit, with payment deferred until delivery. When prices collapsed, buyers simply walked away from their contracts, leaving sellers holding worthless inventory and unpaid obligations. The legal system, overwhelmed by thousands of disputed contracts, effectively stopped enforcing tulip-related agreements. Within 6 weeks, tulip prices had fallen by over 95%. Bulbs that had sold for thousands of guilders in January were worth less than ordinary onions by March. The Semper Augustus tulip, which had commanded 10,000 guilders at its peak, couldn't find buyers at 50 guilders. The entire speculative structure collapsed so completely that many tulip contracts became literally worthless, not worth the paper they were written on. The human cost was immediate and severe. Families who had mortgaged their homes to buy tulip contracts faced bankruptcy and eviction. Craftsmen who had abandoned their trades for tulip speculation discovered they had no income and no marketable skills. Professional merchants found their businesses destroyed by tulip-related debts and obligations. But the economic damage extended far beyond direct tulip losses. The collapse destroyed confidence in Dutch financial markets, made credit much harder to obtain, and created a deflationary spiral that affected legitimate businesses throughout the economy. International investors, who had viewed Dutch markets as uniquely stable and sophisticated, withdrew their capital and looked elsewhere for opportunities. Most tragically, the tulip crash demonstrated how quickly financial innovation could be transformed from economic advantage into economic disaster. The same futures contracts, credit mechanisms, and speculative instruments that had made the Dutch Republic wealthy had also made it vulnerable to mass delusion and collective irrationality. The aftermath of tulip mania created problems that Dutch authorities had never encountered before. How do you restore confidence in financial markets after widespread speculation has destroyed trust? How do you handle thousands of disputed contracts when the legal system wasn't designed for mass default? How do you prevent future bubbles without destroying the financial innovations that create prosperity? The Dutch government's response revealed both the sophistication and limitations of 17th century economic policy. Rather than intervening directly in tulip markets, authorities declared that all tulip contracts signed after November 1636 would be treated as gambling debts, legally unenforceable and not subject to normal commercial law. This decision protected many speculators from total ruin, but also established a dangerous precedent. Speculative excess could be forgiven through government intervention. Religious and civic leaders launched moral campaigns against speculation, gambling, and get-rich-quick schemes. These efforts had limited impact because they failed to address the underlying economic and social forces that had created tulip mania. The Dutch Republic remained a wealthy, innovative society with sophisticated financial markets and a culture that celebrated commercial success. The conditions that had enabled tulip speculation remained in place. More problematically, the tulip crash created lasting distortions in Dutch economic behavior. Many investors became excessively risk-averse, avoiding legitimate investment opportunities because they feared another speculative bubble. Others became addicted to speculation, always searching for the next tulip-like opportunity that would restore their fortunes. Both responses damaged long-term economic growth and financial stability. The international consequences were equally significant. Foreign observers concluded that Dutch financial markets were dangerously unstable and prone to irrational behavior. Capital flows that had previously supported Dutch commercial expansion began shifting to other financial centers. The tulip crash didn't destroy Dutch prosperity, but it marked the beginning of the end of the Republic's position as Europe's dominant financial power. The patterns established during Dutch tulip mania have repeated with remarkable consistency across 4 centuries of financial history. Every major speculative bubble, from the South Sea Company in 1720 to the dot-com boom in 2000 to the GameStop squeeze in 2021, has followed the same psychological and economic dynamics that destroyed tulip markets in 1637. Consider the striking parallels. In 1636, Dutch speculators convinced themselves that tulips were uniquely valuable because they were beautiful, rare, and internationally coveted. In 1999, dot-com investors convinced themselves that internet companies were uniquely valuable because they were innovative, scalable, and globally accessible. In 2021, cryptocurrency enthusiasts convinced themselves that digital tokens were uniquely valuable because they were decentralized, scarce, and technologically advanced. The social dynamics are identical across centuries. Tulip speculators dismissed critics as old-fashioned and jealous. Dot-com investors dismissed warnings as failure to understand the new economy. Crypto traders dismissed skeptics as not understanding blockchain technology. In each case, rational valuation methods are abandoned in favor of narratives that justify unlimited price increases. Modern financial markets have amplified these historical patterns through technological innovation. Where Dutch tulip traders needed to meet in taverns to exchange contracts, today speculators can buy and sell assets instantly through smartphone apps. Where 17th century speculation was limited by physical proximity and personal networks, modern speculation spreads globally through social media and online communities. The democratization of speculation has reached levels that would have amazed Dutch tulip traders. Ordinary people can now trade complex derivatives, buy fractional shares of expensive assets, and speculate on everything from individual stocks to global currencies. The same financial innovations that create opportunity also create vulnerability to mass delusion and collective irrationality. Most disturbingly, modern bubbles occur with increasing frequency and severity. The time between major speculative manias has shortened from decades to years, while the economic damage has grown from regional to global. The tulip crash affected primarily the Dutch Republic. The 2008 financial crisis affected the entire world economy. First, financial innovation without psychological wisdom is dangerous. The Dutch had created the world's most sophisticated financial markets, but they hadn't developed the cultural and regulatory frameworks necessary to prevent mass speculation. Modern societies face the same challenge. Our financial tools have advanced far beyond our understanding of how those tools interact with human psychology and social dynamics. Second, rational people can create irrational markets. Tulip mania wasn't caused by ignorant peasants or primitive markets. It was created by intelligent, experienced merchants using advanced financial instruments. The individual rationality of seeking profit became collective irrationality when everyone made the same assumptions at the same time. This pattern repeats whenever smart people convince themselves that normal rules don't apply to special circumstances. Third, bubbles are features, not bugs of free markets. The same financial innovations that create prosperity credit, futures contracts, speculative trading also create vulnerability to bubbles and crashes. Preventing bubbles entirely would require eliminating the market mechanisms that drive economic growth. The challenge is managing bubble risk without destroying market benefits. Here's the warning that emerges from tulip mania. We are living through the most speculative period in human history, with more people having access to more complex financial instruments than ever before. The psychological forces that drove Dutch tulip traders to pay house prices for flower bulbs are now amplified by social media, algorithmic trading, and global connectivity. The question isn't whether another bubble will occur. The patterns of history suggest it's inevitable. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize speculative mania before it destroys wealth, relationships, and economic stability. If this story of how flowers nearly destroyed civilization's most advanced economy has changed how you think about modern markets and speculation, subscribe to The Economic Historian for more stories that reveal how past financial disasters illuminate present dangers. Next week, we'll explore how the Rothschild family used carrier pigeons and superior information to build history's greatest banking empire. The debate that began in Dutch tulip fields continues in cryptocurrency forums, meme stock communities, and social media trading groups. Your perspective is part of that ongoing conversation. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now it's rhyming louder than it has since 1637.